$7 billion, that is how much Mark Carney just spent to end 70 years of American Arctic dominance. Not through diplomacy, not through negotiations, through pure strategic force. One budget allocation that rewrote the rules of global shipping and left Trump staring at a locked door to a $900 billion trade corridor he thought belonged to America forever. Sovereignty isn't what you claim on paper, it is what you can actually control, Carney said, announcing Canada's largest Arctic infrastructure investment in history. Those weren't just words. They were a declaration of war against decades of American presumption that Canadian waters were their personal highway. But here is what nobody saw coming. Trump's threats to annex Canada didn't weaken them. They weaponized the most dangerous man in global finance. But before we dive into this incredible power play, if you appreciate analysis that cuts through the noise, hit that like button and subscribe for the stories that reshape the world. Tonight, we're showing you how Carney turned American bullying into Canadian conquest, why this $7 billion investment just locked America out of the most valuable shipping route on Earth, and how one former central banker became the architect of the greatest geopolitical reversal of the 21st century. Let's start with the man himself. Mark Carney isn't just any politician. He is the former governor of both the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England. The first foreigner to ever run Britain's central bank. The man who steered two economies through the 2008 financial crisis without a single bank failure. When Carney speaks about economic power, the world listens. But what happens when you push a master strategist into a corner? Trump found out the hard way. For months, Trump treated Canada like a subordinate territory, called them the 51st state, threatened 25% tariffs on everything, insisted Canadian resources belonged to America by right. He assumed economic pressure would force submission. That size meant leverage. That allies had no choice but to accept American demands. He was spectacularly wrong. The moment Trump started his annexation threats, Carney saw something others missed. The Northwest Passage, a shipping route through the Canadian Arctic that cuts 7,000 kilometers off the journey between Asia and Europe. Climate change had made it navigable. Global warming had unlocked a $900 billion opportunity, and legally, it all belonged to Canada. But there was one problem for 70 years. America treated those waters like their personal property. U.S. submarines surfaced at the North Pole in Canadian territory and called it international waters. American ships sailed through Canadian Arctic channels without asking permission. When Canada protested, Washington's response was simple: we don't need permission, and we're not going to ask for it. They were right. Canada claimed sovereignty but couldn't enforce it. No infrastructure, no military presence. No way to actually control who used the passage. So America, Russia, and China all treated Canadian Arctic claims as polite fiction. Then Mark Carney released his first federal budget, $1 billion for Arctic infrastructure over 4 years. But that was just the opening move. The real shock came with the centerpiece. $7 billion for 2 polar-class icebreakers capable of breaking through 3 meters of ice, operating year-round at temperatures down to -50 degrees Celsius. Not just any icebreakers. Ships designed to establish permanent Canadian presence in Arctic waters, regardless of conditions. Ships that could require vessels to check in, accept Canadian pilots, follow environmental regulations, and pay fees for navigation services. Physical presence creates legal facts, and Carney was about to create a lot of facts. The Port of Churchill project alone received $180 million over 5 years. Canada's only Arctic region deep water port connected by rail to the rest of the country, sitting on Hudson Bay with direct access to Arctic Ocean and Atlantic shipping routes. Carney's investment would extend the shipping season from 4 months to potentially year-round operations, creating infrastructure for exporting grain, potash, liquefied natural gas, and critical minerals. But Churchill was just the beginning. The broader Arctic Infrastructure Fund targeted airports in the far north, all-weather roads connecting isolated communities and mining sites, expanded Coast Guard presence, new radar and surveillance systems, military facilities supporting year-round operations instead of just summer exercises. The timeline was aggressive. First icebreaker delivery planned for 2030. Second by 2032. Churchill port upgrades beginning immediately. Critical minerals export infrastructure operational within 5 years. This wasn't a long-term vision. This was happening now. Here is what Trump didn't understand about challenging a master strategist. Carney wasn't just building icebreakers. He was building leverage. Once Canada has icebreakers patrolling year-round, they can enforce regulations. Once there are functioning ports offering refueling and repairs, ships have reasons to comply with Canadian authority rather than risk being denied services. The United States can keep insisting the passage is international waters, but if Canada has the physical infrastructure to regulate traffic, monitor vessels, and conduct inspections, legal arguments become increasingly irrelevant. And here is the strategic nightmare for Washington. China and Russia are watching very carefully. If America succeeds in treating the Northwest Passage as international waters, that sets a precedent. Chinese vessels can claim the same right of passage, Russian ships too. Any nation can transit without Canadian permission. That is catastrophic for North American security. The entire reason NORAD exists is to defend the continent from threats coming over the Arctic. If hostile nations have unrestricted access to Arctic waters adjacent to North America, that defensive perimeter collapses. But here is where Carney's masterstroke becomes clear. By forcing the sovereignty issue now, he is not just defending Canadian territory. He is defending American security interests that Washington is too stubborn to recognize. Some American strategists have started quiet conversations about whether the United States should reconsider its position, whether North American security actually requires supporting Canadian sovereignty over the passage rather than opposing it. But those conversations require Washington to admit it was wrong for 70 years, accepting that Canada, not the United States, controls access to a $900 billion trade corridor. Trump isn't capable of that kind of strategic recalculation, and every month that passes, Canada builds more infrastructure that makes their sovereignty claim more concrete. The economic implications are staggering. A container ship traveling from Shanghai to New York through the Northwest Passage saves over 6,000 kilometers compared to the Panama Canal route. That is days of travel time, millions in fuel costs, faster delivery for time-sensitive cargo. Current projections suggest the passage could handle between 2 to 5% of global shipping traffic in coming decades. That is $400 billion to $1 trillion annually. But it is not just about shipping. The Canadian Arctic sits on massive deposits of critical minerals, rare earth elements, nickel, copper, lithium, zinc, gold, resources essential for electric vehicles, defense systems, renewable energy technology. For decades, these deposits were economically unviable because getting them to market was impossibly expensive. The Northwest Passage changes that equation completely. Carney just turned Canada into a critical mineral superpower, and whoever controls access to the passage controls the gateway to those resources. The great irony is that Trump's pressure on Canada might end up benefiting Russia and China more than anyone. When Carney started diversifying Canadian trade partnerships that included exploring Arctic cooperation with nations America wants Canada to resist. Chinese investment in Canadian Arctic projects is suddenly on the table in ways it never was before. And if America keeps insisting the Northwest Passage is international waters, that directly benefits China, Beijing can claim the right to transit Canadian Arctic waters any time it wants, using the same legal argument Washington makes. This is Trump's strategic blunder in miniature. He thought he could pressure Canada without consequences. Instead, he pushed them toward exactly the kind of Arctic independence that undermines American strategic interests in the region. By early next decade, Canada will have functioning deepwater ports, permanent icebreaker presence, expanded military infrastructure, and the physical capability to regulate traffic through the Northwest Passage. Regardless of what other nations claim about its legal status, Trump expected Canada to fold. He assumed economic pressure would force submission, that size meant leverage, that allies had no choice but to accept American demands. Instead, he triggered the largest Canadian Arctic infrastructure investment in history and gave Canada the motivation to finally back up sovereignty claims with actual physical presence. The empty chair at Trump's negotiating table isn't because Canada is weak. It is because Mark Carney is too busy building an Arctic future that doesn't depend on American permission. And every icebreaker Canada launches makes that future more real and American influence more irrelevant. The Arctic is opening, the passage is clearing, and Canada just staked its claim in ways Washington can no longer prevent. Trump thought he was demonstrating American strength. Mark Carney showed the world how to resist it. But this isn't Carney's first victory against impossible odds. Remember 2008? While American banks collapsed like dominoes, Carney kept every single Canadian bank operational. When Britain faced Brexit chaos, he stabilized their entire financial system. Now he is applying that same ruthless precision to geopolitical warfare, and the results are already showing. European shipping companies have quietly begun exploring Arctic route feasibility studies. Asian manufacturers are calculating transportation cost savings. Investment firms are analyzing Canadian mineral extraction opportunities. The global shipping industry is preparing for a reality where Canada, not America, controls access to the most valuable trade route on Earth. Here is what makes this even more devastating for Trump. The Arctic investment creates a permanent economic moat. Unlike tariffs that can be reversed, or trade deals that can be renegotiated, infrastructure is permanent. Once those icebreakers are built, once those ports are operational, once that military presence is established, it cannot be undone. Carney understands something Trump never grasped. Real power isn't about making threats. It is about creating facts on the ground that make your threats irrelevant. The timing couldn't be more perfect. Climate change is accelerating. Arctic ice melt faster than experts predicted. Some projections now suggest ice-free summers as early as 2030. Every month of delay gives competitors advantages Canada can't recover. Carney isn't just building for current conditions. He is positioning Canada to dominate Arctic trade for the next century. But perhaps the most brilliant aspect of Carney's strategy is how he has turned Trump's aggression into international legitimacy. When America threatens to annex Canada, the world sees Canadian Arctic investments as defensive necessity. When Trump calls Canada the 51st state, European allies rally to support Canadian sovereignty. When Washington insists Canadian waters are international, Beijing and Moscow start asking uncomfortable questions about American territorial claims elsewhere. Trump gave Carney the perfect justification for the largest military and infrastructure expansion in Canadian history. And now it is too late to stop. The Pentagon has quietly begun reassessing Arctic defense strategies. State Department officials have started informal conversations about potential compromise positions. American shipping interests are lobbying for negotiated access agreements. The same Washington establishment that insisted Canada had no leverage is scrambling to find face-saving solutions to a problem they created. But Carney isn't interested in face-saving. He is interested in sovereignty. And sovereignty backed by $7 billion in Arctic infrastructure is sovereignty that cannot be challenged. Within 5 years, American ships wanting to use the Northwest Passage will need to ask Canadian permission, accept Canadian pilots, follow Canadian environmental regulations, and pay Canadian fees. Russian vessels will face the same requirements. Chinese ships too. Every nation that once treated Canadian Arctic waters as their personal highway will now need to negotiate with Ottawa. The $900 billion trade corridor Trump thought belonged to the world now belongs to Canada. And the architect of that transformation is a former central banker who understood that in the modern world, economic power and military power are the same thing. Mark Carney didn't just drop a $7 billion bomb on American Arctic ambitions. He rewrote the rules of continental power. Trump wanted to annex Canada economically. Instead, Carney annexed the Arctic strategically. The student just became the master, and the lesson is clear. Threaten Canada at your own peril. The age of American Arctic dominance is over. The age of Canadian Arctic sovereignty has begun, and it all started with one man's refusal to be bullied and $7 billion that changed everything.